In the bitter winter of 1943, as the Soviet war machine began to turn the tide in the east, a small dot on the map became the stage for an unexpected stand. Krasny Bor, at the gates of Leningrad, witnessed an uneven clash between a marching colossus and a handful of foreigners, determined not to fall back. There, under a storm of fire, 5,000 Spanish soldiers of the Blue Division dug in against a massive Red Army offensive. More than 33,000 Soviets, backed by tanks and artillery, struck at an enemy that seemed doomed from the first shot. But what was supposed to be a quick victory turned into a prolonged bloodbath. What happened that day was not a simple defense. It was an act of defiance, sacrifice, and history. This was the Battle of Krasny Bor.
Una bandera española de pronto hace su aparición en las tristes ciudades de Polonia. Pasan las vanguardias de la División Azul. Son los estudiantes del SEU. Nada hace detenerse a los ejércitos del Reich, que en los primeros encuentros hace saltar hecho añicos el férreo dispositivo de los soviets. La artillería, los tanques, la infantería arrollan a la tremenda defensa rusa.
At the beginning of 1943, the Soviet High Command prepared to deliver a decisive blow on the Eastern Front. The recent victory at Stalingrad had changed the balance of the war, and now the Red Army held the initiative. In that context, an ambitious plan took shape to break the siege of Leningrad from the south and encircle the German 18th Army, one of the key pieces of Nazi defense in the northern sector. The operation, designed by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, sought a rapid, forceful breakthrough. To that end, the Stavka put more than 33,000 men of the Soviet 55th Army into motion, backed by about 100 tanks and over 1,000 artillery pieces. The blow was to fall on Krasny Bor, a small but vital point along the road that connected the Soviet capital, Moscow, with Leningrad, a tactical objective because of its strategic position. What the Soviets did not expect was that this sector of the front was defended by a mix of German troops and Spanish volunteers of the Blue Division.
Donde una juventud sin pareja en el mundo se vuelve a alzar, inagotable de entusiasmo, contra el enemigo del Este. España, de polo a polo, se siente estremecida por el grito de la cruzada, lo más selecto de la joven generación madrileña, la flor de su falange, heroica y fundadora. La aristocracia de la universidad, del campo y del taller pide un sitio en la división que se forma bajo el nombre de División Azul.
Just days after Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union, Francisco Franco saw a political opportunity. Spain, ravaged by civil war, was in no condition to enter another conflict, but the Francoist regime shared with the Third Reich a common enemy: communism. Spain swore neutrality, yet it sent thousands of its sons to the white hell of the East. Franco could not risk a formal declaration of war, which would have provoked reprisals from the Allies, still dominant in the Atlantic. Instead, he found a middle solution: create a volunteer unit to fight alongside Germany on the Eastern Front. Thus was born the Spanish Volunteer Division, better known as the Blue Division. Between 1941 and 1943, more than 47,000 Spaniards passed through its ranks. Some were convinced Falangist fascists exalted by the idea of an anti-communist crusade. Others were veterans of the Civil War who still breathed the air of vengeance. There were also youths driven by a desire for glory, and even prisoners offered commutations in exchange for fighting. It was a strange legion where fervor, need and deceit lived side by side.
Franco procuró que no se diera publicidad a los hombres provenientes del ejército español, y sí a los falangistas, de tal manera que la División Azul pareciera únicamente compuesta de voluntarios deseosos de luchar contra el comunismo, y no de miembros de la milicia que cumplían órdenes. Así, España no estaba oficialmente en guerra contra la Unión Soviética.
In that way, Franco avoided crossing the line, yet he drew it in blood. The Blue Division was born of ambiguous diplomacy and ideological fanaticism, the child of a regime playing a double game. Even so, regardless of what surrounded it, for Germany it was a useful and symbolic force. The Spaniards represented ideological adherence to Nazism without Spain officially entering the war. For Franco, it was a way to settle his debt to Hitler, whose Condor Legion had bombed Spain during the Civil War without fully committing. Everyone profited from this division, so the volunteers went to Germany, trained in Bavarian camps, were instructed by German officers, and were equipped with Wehrmacht uniforms and weapons.
Los voluntarios atravesaron entonces en tren la Francia ocupada por los nazis, para llegar al campo militar de Grafenborn en Baviera entre el 17 y el 23 de julio de 1941. Todos llevaban el uniforme de sus unidades españolas. Al negarse los falangistas a deshacerse de su camisa azul y al incorporarla a su uniforme alemán, la unidad fue conocida a partir de entonces como Blau División o División Azul.
On their helmets, armbands, and standards, the Spanish symbols remained. The national flag, the imperial eagle, and, above all, the cross of St. Andrew. They were not soldiers of a state at war, but they marched as if they were. German attire, Spanish flag, and hatred of communism. On the Eastern Front, the Blue Division was assigned to Army Group North in the Leningrad sector. Throughout 1942, they fought hard on the banks of the Volkhov and Lake Ilmen. There they endured brutal cold, disease, shortages, and the blows of an enemy fired by Soviet patriotism. By early 1943, the Blue Division was weakened, scattered, and poorly supplied. Even so, about 5,000 of its men still defended a key sector of the front, Krasny Bor. There, in the least expected place, they would become protagonists of one of the bloodiest battles of the Leningrad siege. From dawn on February 10th, the sky over Krasny Bor shook with the roar of more than 1,000 Soviet guns.
Efectivamente, a las 7 de la mañana empezó la artillería. Aquello era el diluvio de proyectiles, Caían unos tras de otros en el mismo sitio, pero eso de que dicen que un obús no cae donde ha caído otro, allí era totalmente falso.
The bombardment lasted for hours, throwing up columns of fire, snow, and debris over the Spanish positions. Trenches collapsed, telephone lines were cut, and the earth itself seemed to crack under the incessant pounding. When the first armored vehicles began to move, the frozen ground roared beneath nearly 100 T-34s, while tens of thousands of soldiers crossed the front like an unstoppable tide. The orders were clear: break the line and open the road to Leningrad. But the attackers had not counted on the human wall that awaited them. Amid the chaos, the Spaniards of the Blue Division reorganized at speed, improvising defenses, occupying ruins, and manning half-buried machine gun nests. They knew they were alone. They knew they were surrounded. They chose to resist. In the words of a veteran, fighting was the only thing we had left.
Sus trincheras, los supervivientes de las tropas españolas de primera línea reagrupan sus fuerzas y fortifican como pueden sus posiciones. Se enfrentan entonces a una marea soviética muy superior en hombres y material y resisten luchando hasta la muerte.
Thus began one of the bloodiest days on the Eastern Front, one in which military logic clashed with the stubbornness of a few. Operation Polar Star had been set in motion, but the outcome would be very different from what its planners expected. With snow covering the battlefield and thick fog wrapping the northern forests, hell broke loose. A reduced Spanish force stood between the Soviet ranks and victory. The offensive of the Red Army's 55th Army, a key component of Operation Polar Star, hurled itself like an avalanche onto the small sector of Krasny Bor. Defended mostly by the Blue Division, it was a rain of fire. For more than 2 hours, roughly 700 Soviet artillery pieces pounded the Spanish positions without pause. The skies roared, the ground erupted, and communications failed before the first ground assault. With lines cut, a Blue Division soldier in the rear was sent to observe the battlefield, and this is how he remembered it.
Cuando llegué allí casi me asusté. Un desorden tenían tal es que no se podían dar, te podías meter entre los rusos tranquilamente que nadie iba a sospechar quién eras. Porque carros de combate por todos sitios, piezas de artillería no paraban de pasar, formaciones de tropa, carros de combate, el organillos no sé cuántos, en fin, aquello era de miedo lo que había allí.
Bunkers were leveled. Trenches opened like wounds. Hundreds died before even gripping their rifles. Then came the attack. More than 100 T-34s pushed through the fog like steel beasts, followed by infantry divisions that seemed never-ending.
Las máquinas y los fusileros empezaron allí a barrer. Y estas máquinas alemanas que hacen unos 1.400 disparos por minuto, en una masa así, pues claro, enseguida al rato estaba el suelo lleno de gente y los pocos que quedaban sanos retrocediendo para atrás. Pero acto seguido salía otra oleada y otra oleada y otra oleada hasta 6 o 7 oleadas así que rechazamos.
Against all predictions, what should have been a swift, devastating offensive turned into desperate resistance. The trenches of Krasny Bor became open graves, where men fought with more courage than ammunition. Outnumbered 7-1, the Spaniards answered with grenades, rifles, improvised mines, and Molotov cocktails. Some tried to jam enemy machine guns with their own hands. Others detonated explosives as tanks passed. One of them was Corporal Antonio Ponte Anido. Seeing a Soviet tank approach the field hospital where dozens of wounded awaited aid, he ran under fire and threw himself against it with an anti-tank mine, sacrificing himself and stopping the vehicle just meters from the building. His body was blown apart, but his action saved the lives of hundreds of comrades.
En Krasny Bor, la artillería azul y los ingenieros son asaltados por la infantería y los blindados soviéticos, que abren fuego contra el hospital y las ambulancias. Pero finalmente son rechazados con cócteles Molotov y granadas de mano por los españoles.
For hours, shells fell as if the sky were splitting open, yet the Spaniards kept firing through smoke and ice. The extreme cold, the frozen mud, the fallen bodies mixing with red snow. Krasny Bor became a white hell. In some sectors, uniforms could no longer be distinguished. Men fought hand-to-hand, trench against trench, bayonets fixed and teeth clenched. The Soviets achieved partial gains, breaking positions on the flanks and seizing secondary points. But the core of the defense held. The fighting stretched for more than 24 hours, and in the end, the Soviet advance stalled. Torn apart but still standing, the Blue Division had stopped the assault.
Que después de las 12, la 63 División de Infantería de la Guardia Roja anuncia la captura de Krasny Bor, gracias a la resistencia de los divisionarios azules, solo pueden controlar la mitad sur de la villa.
The cost was terrible. The Spaniards suffered more than 3,600 casualties, nearly 70% of the defenders. Many battalions were reduced to a handful of survivors. But the Soviets paid even more. Over 11,000 dead, wounded, and missing. Dozens of tanks destroyed, and a key offensive frustrated, halting the Red Army's advance for crucial days. Stalin had to accept failure. Operation Polar Star, intended to break the Leningrad siege and collapse the German front from the south, had faltered at Krasny Bor. History recorded one of the most unequal and ferocious battles on the Eastern Front. In Krasny Bor, the Blue Division did not fight for Hitler, nor for Franco. It fought for its comrades. That is why the impossible became resistance, if only for an instant. The battle's impact was a political earthquake whose echoes reverberated in Madrid, Berlin, and Moscow. In a matter of hours, a volunteer unit from a neutral country had contained an army of tens of thousands. The feat, stained with blood and ice, became invaluable propaganda for the Francoist regime.
Los héroes de la jornada reciben su premio. Junto a las cruces ganadas en la Guerra de España, los más valientes lucen ya la Cruz de Hierro. El glorioso general Muñoz Grandes suma un grado más a sus recompensas. se le entrega la Cruz de Caballero, que es el primer general extranjero en recibir en esta campaña.
The regime made Krasny Bor an altar of propaganda while burying its dead in silence. Falangist newspapers quickly filled their front pages with grandiose headlines. Heroes of Spain on the Eastern Front, against red barbarism, eternal glory to our fallen. The heroism of the Blue Division was presented as irrefutable proof of Spain's commitment to the fight against communism, a narrative carefully constructed by the Francoist ideological apparatus. Spain fought without declaring war and bled for a cause it later denied supporting. Officially, the country remained neutral. In practice, Franco applied an active neutrality, a delicate balancing act to ingratiate himself with Hitler, hoping for future benefits. The regime dreamed of recovering Gibraltar, expanding its influence in North Africa, or gaining clout in a Europe soon to be dominated by the Axis. But the winds of war had already begun to change. The German defeat at Stalingrad, just weeks earlier, marked a decisive turn. While the Blue Division held at Krasny Bor, the Francoist High Command began to suspect that betting on the Third Reich could become a post-war burden. In Germany, the Spanish performance drew admiration. German officers sent letters of praise to the High Command, and Joseph Goebbels himself lauded the heroic Spanish comrades. In Moscow, the result was a monumental humiliation. More than 11,000 casualties in a single day without breaking a supposedly weak front was a bitter pill. The failure at Krasny Bor delayed Soviet plans in the southern Leningrad sector for months. For Stalin, it was not only a military setback, it was a political embarrassment. With the Allied advance in North Africa and British and American attitudes hardening toward fascist regimes, Franco shifted course. In October 1943, the Spanish government ordered the official dissolution of the Blue Division, an attempt to erase the traces of its commitment. Even so, hundreds of Spanish volunteers refused to return. They remained at the front, integrated directly into the Wehrmacht, fighting to the end as part of the Légion Azul, without official recognition. For many, the commitment was neither to Franco nor to Hitler, but to the comrades they had left behind. The Battle of Krasny Bor was more than a clash in the snow. It was the brutal reflection of a war Spain did not declare, yet did fight. 5,000 volunteers faced an overwhelming enemy, driven by ideology, duty, or deceit. They resisted with courage, but were used and then forgotten. While the Soviets counted their losses and the Germans handed out praise, Franco kept silent. Krasny Bor was the uncomfortable glory of a regime that wanted to be in the war without owning it, the last echo of a Falangist dream that faded among snow, blood, and ambiguity. And so we come to the end. If you enjoyed this video, we'll see you in our next episode as we continue to explore military history.